Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. I'm your regular host, Arif, and I'm joined as always by
your other host, which is TK, the guardian of the great audio quality.
Thanks, TK. Welcome to our listeners for another episode, of our podcast, Leading with Agility. We're excited today to be joined by Rupert Bull. Rupert has over 25 years of fintech experience within both large organizations, such as Reuters and Instinet, and startups. He co-founded, built, and sold Expand Research, the leading capital markets benchmarking and research business, to the Boston Consulting Group in 2011, before leaving to found the Disruption House in early 2015. Welcome, Rupert, to the show, and thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome, Arif. I'm delighted to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we'll maybe come back to the Disruption House and what you're doing there a bit later. Let's just kick off today's episode by discussing a bit about your passions around ESG. In order to do that, I think, as I ask all our guests to expand or share some thoughts on what leadership means to them, and perhaps you can take inspiration from the work you do in ESG to answer that question and share some insights with our listeners.
Thanks, Arif. So I think actually where leadership and sustainability come together is really around authenticity. It is, as with sustainability, so with leadership, there are compromises. There's not a binary 1 or 0. I think, in both instances, you're living in the real world, and in living in the real world, you're dealing with people, and ultimately, as people, we live on the planet. So I think the thing about leadership is a large part of what I try to do is to engender trust in the team around me. I think anybody who's been in business knows that business is not a straight line. And whilst there can be clearly articulated visions and missions and a strategy, in reality, everything can be distracted by events. And I think it was Harold Macmillan who said the thing that he feared most as Prime Minister was events, because you can't predict them. Mm-hmm. And I think in reality, in business, there are a whole range of external events that can happen, and you have to be able to adapt to that, which is where agility comes in. But I think you have to stay true to your core vision and principles. Otherwise, you look like you were chopping and changing the whole time, and that undermines trust. And I think it's the same with sustainability. One has to have a vision of what one's trying to achieve as a business with a sustainability strategy, and continue to have that as a reference point as one grows a business and seeks to lead it into its future.
That's a really good answer. Thank you. I love how you've blended in the agility aspect there and the idea of events. And I think when we look at agile leadership and the work we do, that fits nicely with this idea of unpredictability or volatility in the world around us, and how leaders need to be able to react or behave in a way that assumes that is just natural part of, as you said, doing business, running a team, or being a leader, and how you your leadership attributes to respond to that, I suppose. When it comes to the sustainability aspect, and you've mentioned authenticity, Rupert, what is it that you think, leaders need to demonstrate in terms of that authenticity in order to take sustainability seriously? Could you expand on that, perhaps?
Well, I think there are, ultimately several aspects to that. I think it's impossible for an organization to be sustainable unless that is committed to from the top of the organization. I think it's not dissimilar in probably other aspect of being in business, such as innovation, which is that it's relatively easy to talk the talk, but you have to demonstrate that you are walking the walk. And I think that becomes more important as you're dealing with larger organizations. So I think, if one looks at any organization where there are fewer layers between the C-suite and everybody, then everybody in the organization, so by that I mean organizations probably up to 100 people, can see on a reasonably regular basis the leadership and how they go about things, and they can see that they are living alongside what they say, and if they're not, it becomes apparent very quickly that they're not behaving authentically, with authenticity. I think that, as organizations grow and you can't get everyone into one place where you can have a town hall, then it becomes really important that there are processes to support statements and leadership as well as statements, because organizations are delivered, the business outcomes delivered by what is really middle and senior management. And middle and senior management have a whole series of KPIs that they are judged by and reviewed over the course of a year. And they will be covering multiple facets of the life cycle of a business. Mm-hmm. And if people respond to whatever stimulus or incentive they're given. So I think if there's a range of KPIs, and some of those include sustainability commitments, if management is not seen to be making that same level of commitment, mm-hmm. then the next layer down and the layer down below that will think, well, actually, they don't care about it. So although it's my KPI, I will actually do the things that I see management making most effort for.
Yes. How they model it, yeah.
And so their behavior will be dictated to both by the KPIs they're given, but actually also how they see the senior leadership team operating and organizing and communicating.
So with that, if I may, Rupert, the one thing that you've mentioned is about the authenticity of senior leaders, especially in large organizations. And you said that, obviously there have to be processes. And I do agree that it's difficult for people to see these senior leaders as authentic because they're so detached, especially in other larger organizations. Now I'm wondering, we've mentioned KPIs, which is one of the possible processes, but what is it from your experience that you have seen in large organizations that helps them see their senior leaders as authentically caring? Are there any examples you could give us?
So I think it's it will vary from organization to organization. So if one sort of looks at sustainability, or some of the things that are part of the sustainability journey, you could be looking at community and charity engagement. So one example that I have used in the past is one of our clients had business operations in Pakistan, or still has business operations in Pakistan, mm-hmm. as well as in the UK. And when the enormously devastating floods hit Pakistan, the immediate response of the C-suite was to make a donation to the Disasters and Emergency Committee in response to seeing an advertisement on television for the relief of the consequence of the flood. I mean, it was an immediate disaster, and there was a need for immediate disaster relief and support and clothing and food and all those other things that go with disasters. Okay. At the same time as that was happening, we were actually running an employee ESG awareness survey for the client, and we were asking what mattered to the staff. And what was interesting is the feedback from the staff was that actually community engagement was very important, but they would like to see the commitment of the firm to female education in Pakistan, because they felt that was long-term, systemically changing And that's where they wanted to see the organization put its shoulder to the wheel. Now, neither of those is in absolute terms right or wrong, but senior management could have just gone ahead and written the check to the Disaster Emergency Committee and said to the organization, we've made a donation on behalf of everybody, and this is what we've done. But actually what they did was say, well, we take into account the feedback we've had from our staff about this is important, and they split the money. So they said, we are making a donation because there's a need for immediate disaster relief because people are struggling very badly and exposed. But actually, we also recognise that it's the analogy of if you give a person a fish, they eat for a day. If you teach a person to fish, they feed for a lifetime. So again, these sort of things. So I think what came through is the fact there was a dialogue meant that the staff felt that management were listening to what mattered to them, and therefore management felt authentic because they weren't just saying we're doing something because we're ticking a box because it makes us feel good. I'm not saying that's what was behind their process, but it can come through that there is a bit of a formulaic behavior. And I think the larger the organization you get, then, more often elements of how that organization is run is to some extent via ticking boxes because actually they're part of the process. So I think that's what I mean about authenticity. Yeah. If you say you're going to do something and make the effort to launch a consultation, listen to the results and do something with it. There was no right and wrong answer. And actually in sustainability, there rarely is a right and wrong. It's usually a compromise or a trade-off. But I think once you're making that, communicating it then says that we've done this, we've made this decision and we're communicating it and you can hold us to account for it. That's what delivers authenticity.
I think that is a really, really good example. Thanks, Rupert, because it does chime with, from our perspective as well, that a key message, and I think you'd agree, is from an agile leadership point of view, listening to needs or understanding what your employees' needs are really accelerates, or I suppose accelerates is maybe the wrong word, but fortifies your position as a leader because you are creating the right environment for employees to feel engaged and motivated and all that good stuff. So there's a good link there, I think, in what you've said in terms of listening and engaging. I was doing some other reading prior to our recording, Rupert, and came across a HBR article around sustainability, ESG. And I think what's interesting when I was looking at that, and maybe you can add your thoughts on this, is as society evolves and we have a younger generation that is in employment, which perhaps views societal issues and political issues and environmental issues much more vocally and perhaps in a different manner than previous generations. I think this type of approach that you're describing there around the authenticity and listening is even more vital. So I'm wondering, in your experience, what are the risks to organizations who don't behave in this way, and what could happen to them as time goes on?
So I think there's employee engagement is important. So I gave a presentation earlier this year to a group of accountants and lawyers who are a member of a sort of global alliance, and it was the EMEA leadership meeting. And I said, why does ESG matter to your clients? Because obviously you're a professional service firm, you're in the business service clients. And I said there are really four reasons. One of which is market access. It's increasingly, you don't get to sell to people unless you are able to demonstrate, a commitment to sustainability, which is either a market expectation or it is one that is dictated to by regulation. So there's lots of those regulations coming into force next year in Europe. Right. And so therefore, if you're selling into that, then you need to be conscious of it, and that will, I suppose that's a self-interested bit. But I think because actually you're helping your business to grow. But if you don't help your business grow, then actually you've got no money coming in, and therefore you can't employ people. So so to some extent you have to you have to have your license to operate. But the second point was talent access. And I think when we were sort of looking into, the evidence of it beyond talking to the young talent that we recruit, there was a study that was conducted by Talent LMS, a software business of 1,205 US Gen Z employees. Right. And the findings of that survey were very interesting because they said, the workplace is on the brink of a new shake-up. Gen Z workforce, born digital into a connected world while spending half its waking hours on screen, Gen Z is shaped by internet culture and social feeds. Witnessing social justice movement, shun gender issues, and exploitation of natural resources from early on, they developed a unique sensibility and a strong stance for equity and ethical business practices. So I think there's many statistics about 76% of Gen Zers want to go and work for a business where they can see that it has demonstrated purpose. So, from many different studies, that was one I think that came from PwC recently. But I think broadly speaking, your future talent is looking for evidence that you are, aligned with some of the things they care about.
Yeah, exactly.
I was talking to one of the top 10 UK accounting firms earlier this year, and they are having to go to South Africa to find talent for their accounting business because they're struggling to recruit it here. Now, there's lots of issues with that other than you need people to go and take talent from an emerging country like South Africa to bring it here. And not, has its own issues, right? And we see some of that in terms of our health service and having doctors and nurses coming from the emerging world to serve us here. So there's lots of challenges with doing that whilst preserving, the countries that one is recruiting from. But I think what was interesting is they were struggling to recruit, and as an industry, there is a talent shortage in accountancy.
And that's actually quite interesting. So if I may interrupt a bit, because, accountancy is a good example, right? On one hand, being purpose-driven. On the other hand, a industry that's, not necessarily associated with big, audacious goals and enormous purpose, life and world changing. So if you're in an industry like, accountancy, and professional services like that, which, might not be, dare I say, sexy for Gen Z, how do you find this purpose then? And so you can recruit talent? That's an interesting one for me.
So I think culture is part of it. I think there are many different facets. So I think when you see people responding to surveys, to some extent, they answer the questions that they're asked, just like I'm answering the questions that you're asking me here, TK. But I think, within the context, people want to go and work for businesses that are good businesses to work for.
Okay, yeah.
So there was some interesting research that Rabobank, the Dutch bank, did in 2021. They studied 20,000 of the SME customers. And they found that those SME customers with a poor ESG score were twice as likely to be in arrears on their loan repayments as those with a good ESG score, all other risks being the same. And they looked at it and they scratched their heads and they said, why would this be? Because there's not in ESG anything that you would regard as a credit risk indicator.
Yeah, theoretically.
But they came to the conclusion that actually a business with a good ESG score was a better run business, and a better run business is a better credit risk. So I think, what that is that if you are looking at ES and G, and trying to do something by each of those pillars, you are inevitably having to deal with some complicated issues, and that requires communication and leadership to help address those issues.
Just on that, was curious, what I wanted to, I suppose, expand on is the process behind all of that, in the sense of you're quite rightly highlighting the complexity of the decision making, the trade-offs that need to be made, And that, as you said earlier on, Rupert, there are no easy answers, or there's no right answer, right? There's a cost to any decision that an organisation will make, either immediate or down the line. But in terms of the process of how you see leaders making these decisions, from our point of view, we advocate, for example, that leaders work together with people who are very skilled in these domains, in their function areas, and create what we would call a cross-functional team to basically go and attack the problem and try and solve it, because then you're relying on a multi-skilled group of people to come together and put their best brains together to solve these kind of issues. What have you seen work best in with me saying that, when it comes to this type of situation? Is it what I'm describing? Is it something else? What does your experience tell us?
So, I mean, I think undoubtedly the consequences of the analysis, if you like, and doing something about it require transformation. And I think transformation is best delivered through the approach that you've described there, Arif, because you are going across multiple silos. So I think, that in order to affect change, there needs to be a dialogue that runs across it and explaining why things are happening in the context of what's trying to be achieved and what the outcome will be. And that means that effectively you have representatives of the different silos involved in the conversation. So ultimately, when something is agreed across it, they are stakeholders in the decision, which makes it easier to implement rather than it being imposed upon people. Now, sometimes clearly, if the decision had been, in the example I used earlier, to shut down the data center, then clearly there are major consequences for that. But then you're moving into a program about how can you best support the people who are losing their job because of that decision.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that, but actually, you do at least have to explain what is being achieved and why it's being achieved and what's being done about it. And actually, if that was the case, then there needs to be a transition of the data to a new data center somewhere else, which requires a whole bunch of transformation that comes through as a consequence of it. So that cannot be done in isolation. So I think there's layers of strategy and inputs into strategy, and that will involve a smaller, maybe subset of people who are looking at things, what may be done. But the moment you're starting to move from strategy into execution, then I think your approach is very sensible. And if you don't take some approach very similar to that, you may well struggle to execute it, because actually not taking the organization with you, which is ultimately an organization is made up of people, and therefore,
of course,
if the people are not with you, they're against you, and if they're against you, then actually your program will fail.
Yes, probably dead in the water before it even starts, isn't it? Let's take a break on that point, and then come back in a few moments. Our next webinar will be coming your way on November the 19th, live on LinkedIn. We'll be joined by Chris O'Sullivan, a leader with over 20 years of experience in workplace well-being, to discuss how leaders can better protect their mental health. He'll share practical strategies to help leaders build resilience and thrive under pressure. To register, visit our website, scroll to the bottom of the homepage, and hit that sign up button. See you there. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. Just before the break, we were talking to Rupert about how leaders can engage their workforce with some of these complex problems that they need to solve around sustainability. So it was good to explore that. I wanted to move the conversation on back to leadership in a more broader setting, because many of our listeners may or may not be aware, but Rupert, you studied at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst, and I'm sure had some experiences there that are worthwhile talking about, but especially from a leadership point of view, and maybe exploring how that life of yours has inspired the work you do, and maybe inspired the work you're doing, especially now in ESG. And maybe if you wanted to start there, and then let's see where the conversation goes.
Sure. So I think where this started from was really in our preparation for today, and you were asking a sort of question about what type of leadership attributes do organisations need for them to succeed, and I said, well, the motto of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst is "Serve to Lead," and I think that actually encapsulates an awful lot of what leadership is. I think part of what the British military does, and I think most militaries around the world do it as well. So some of which is in the British tradition, some of which is in their own traditions where they're coming from. But I think that the militaries invest a huge amount of time in leadership training, and from a very early stage, and on the basis that actually, for the most part, the military is changing and has changed from when I served in the military. But broadly speaking, if you don't start at the bottom in the military, it's hard to become a general. Because actually, you to go off and be a leader of a FTSE 100 business doesn't qualify you to be a general in a combat situation. So I think the military invests an awful lot of time early on in leadership training, on the basis that it is training future leaders. Now, most commercial organizations invest in training in skills that are practical, related to the business that they're in. So, you might be a developer or a coder, you might be a cybersecurity expert, but broadly speaking, what organization is training you to be very good at a function, if that's the right word, because actually by coming together, you deliver for the organization what it needs to deliver. But actually, relatively little time is spent early on in leadership development at that point in time. And what happens is people tend to rise up to a position where they are invited to become leaders based upon the skills that they deployed or the money they made for the organization. So actually, it can happen that the leadership of an organization is given to somebody who has not had the same level of preparation, which makes it much more challenging for them. So I think what Sandhurst did was when you start out, you end up with a job running a very small bit of the British military. But what they train you to do is to think about your part in the plan. So the whole orders process that you're trained into is that the general might say, we have to take that town. And actually that is a kilometre on the map from where you are today. But actually the act of taking the town is ultimately not done by the general, but it's done by troops who are on the ground, who are moving into the town, and you take a town house by house, street by street. So to take the town actually requires very different instructions at the micro level, and it can and will be very brutal. I mean, fighting in built up areas is, I think, one of the most attritional things that any military ever does. And you see that in the Ukraine, you see it in Syria, you see it in Iraq, you see it in all places that have been horrible conflicts of recent years. But actually, in the process of taking the town, the person who's going into that street needs to understand how taking that street is part of an overall objective and what they're doing and what they're achieving and why they're doing it. So I think what the military does is it's very good at communicating the overall plan and the part in the plan that the next level down, but they trust the person who is next to come up with a plan to deliver that little bit within the overall plan. So it's a sort of mindset training that means that you actually both are looking down and looking up to understand what is trying to be achieved overall. And very often it's a communication factor, but it's something that I think, in my experience on leaving the military and going into the commercial world, is less often done.
And I think, what is happening is many times the military is being observed as some place that obviously is all about hierarchy, all about command and control, but especially when it comes to Western militaries, it is not the case, although in the Eastern ones it can be different. But not talking about that, what I found definitely interesting, for instance, when exploring the way that leadership is being taught in the military, I remember being told one exercise of, getting a team of people, that's the proper military term, to set up a tent. And, the officers observed as to the people's qualities and how they self-organize. So that's we apply techniques like that ourselves in our leadership development programs, by which I mean helping people gel, helping people do something, and then being able to figure out where they fit, even if it's a small task. Now, I'm wondering from your perspective, in your experience, are there any other techniques when it comes to leadership development that you've seen done in military academies and in the service, in the armed forces, that you think would really benefit the business world if they would be brought in a bit more?
That's a really good question, TK. So I think the one thing that they really focus on is building on your analogy of putting a tent up, is to understand the strengths within your unit and to work to those strengths and to develop people's strengths, but also understand and that some people need to be developed because actually the organization works better holistically if everybody is functioning to the best of their potential. So I think the military is very good at trying to identify the potential within a group of people and develop that so that actually the organization functions better for that, and it's less survival of the fittest. Actually, it's about taking the team with you, because actually the team is stronger than any one individual. I think one of the most deeply unpleasant things that we had to do at Sandhurst was the log run, and the log run is basically a telegraph pole, which is very heavy and wooden, against which rope straps are attached, and you have I can't remember whether it's 8 or 10 people running with the log over cross-country terrain, and from a platoon of 20, 25 people. And within that team of 25 people, there are some very strong, super fit people who are going to go and join, say, the parachute regiments, who pride themselves on their physical fitness.
Yeah.
And in our platoon, we also had 2 guys, one of whom was going to the pay corps and one of whom was going to the education corps. So one was going to be a teacher and one was going to be an accountant. Now, they had to be part of the log race team, and they had to be on the log, as it was called, as much as other people. And we as a platoon won it in our intake at Sandhurst, and I'd forgotten that, other than the pain, until someone sent me a photo of us 20 years on, whatever, saying, remember, we won this. And then you remember actually just how painful it was. But the reality was that you couldn't win unless everybody played their part. And that meant you had to adjust the speed over ground, which you were doing, depending on who was on the log and what their strengths were. But effectively, collectively, we all got the log from A to B, and in a time frame that was the best time, because we balanced the resource and understood. And I think that's something that is embedded in the heart of leadership training, which is, it's not enough just to be the fittest and the fastest, because the fittest and the fastest could have done it not on their own because it was a big log, but effectively, if you just did a team of the fittest and fastest, they would naturally win. But taking a collective group where you've got some people who are supremely physically brilliant, and others who actually probably may never do the same level of physical fitness again after they finish the course together to achieve an outcome. That's something that I think is a very important lesson in terms of creating high performance teams, because actually you make everybody feel an important part of the end result, and you help everyone celebrate the end result because they've been part of delivering it. And I think that's something that is less frequent. It's not absent, but it's something that is less frequent in non-military organizations.
It is less frequent indeed, and as you said, non-absent. But as you're talking, having this maybe reflection that obviously military operations are a violent affair, and life and death situations, and as you said, especially when it comes to urban combat, but also anytime you're doing a military operation, there's serious business going on. And on the other hand, you've got businesses, and yet, as you said, this team spirit is there, this camaraderie, this type of leadership. And then you look on the other side of business, right? You've got, for instance, investment banks or other organizations that somehow develop a very cutthroat, survival of the fittest, very, even would say toxic environment. There's stories about, Revolut, Uber, and so on, right? So even though these people are just sitting in front of their desks, there is no physical danger. They even can be widely successful. So I'm wondering, what is it that, you think, what is the missing piece, I think, that would help these organizations maybe understand that there can be a different way of leadership? Or what do you think could help them maybe make a transition or reflect on the way people work and their cultures work? If it's possible at all.
Well, I would. So I think the answer comes back to sustainability to some extent. So there is a lot of noise in the press about sustainability, wokery, this and that. You see it being played enormously in the American elections coming up.
Yeah.
And I think what's the reason for that is that there's a confusion in many journalists' minds and actually in many people's minds where they conflate ethics and sustainability. And they're actually two separate things, although they can be bucketed together. So it is entirely possible to have a sustainable gun manufacturer where they use green hydrogen to power the electricity that produces the bullets, and the uniforms are made in a manner where they're not made with slave labor, and a fair wage is paid to the staff, and they take into account the water use in the production, right? So, but you're still making kit that is going to be used to kill people. So, actually, you as an investor may choose not to invest in weapons, and you may as an investor choose not to invest in fossil fuels. However, it's perfectly possible for a fossil fuel business to be taking a sustainable approach to the energy transition and moving through time and developing in a sustainable manner. It's perfectly possible to be a tobacco farmer in Africa and pay your staff well and give them holidays, as opposed to not doing so, even though tobacco ultimately, whilst it's a legal product, is now known to lead to killing people. So I think, the part of the challenge is that very often we end up with a very short-term view, and capital markets is often very, very short-term in its view, but so can technology be, because many technology companies in fact, most of the ones that you would mention, the famous, have been funded by venture capital. Yeah. And venture capital is fast money in the sense that it needs results to be achieved quickly. And the capital goes in, and it might go into a portfolio of 10 companies. But the venture capitalist doesn't actually care which of the 10 survive, as long as 2 do, and they grow very successfully and they become future Ubers, because then they return the fund to the investors. Now, venture capitalist ultimately has a fiduciary duty to the investors to give them their money back, but they do so by a form of spread betting and trusting in the creative, destructive principles of capitalism to produce winners. Now, in that environment where the money's coming from and you only get the next money if you achieve certain things, it actually may feel like a life and death situation.
Mm-hmm.
You're being focused in a way differently, because you have to achieve something within 2 years or whatever it happens to be, or 12 months, where the money runs out if you don't do those things. The military, whilst combat is brutal and you lose people, is much more about trying to preserve the organizations as much as possible, and deliver long-term benefits. And I think some of the famous businesses like Unilever, who are a very large business and a very successful business, were formed from Lever brothers, and Lord Leverhulme, back in the late 19th, early 20th century, built Port Sunlight as a place to house the workers of the company in a decent housing way, whilst they paid decent wages. So that business, which is well over 100 years old, has operated on principles of sustainability for a very long time, going back to its predecessor companies. And you look at Cadbury as a company that the founders built Bourneville in Birmingham as a decent housing. You look at Rowntree, which the Joseph Rowntree Foundation now is a very powerful force for good in the UK, and the money for that came from the proceeds of business. And actually, those businesses were committed to sustainability over the long term before ESG even became a phrase. And they lasted a very long time. Cadbury lasted 125 years before it was bought by Kraft. So I think if you think about those things, that's more closely aligned with how the military thinks about developing its people. And if you think about the capital markets and tech, they're on a different time horizon. So I think partly it's about the incentives that are there for the people in the business that makes them perhaps behave differently, because they're not given time, because that's the model. So I think it's a little bit about, but if you embed good culture, you'll attract good people, but you also have to the time to deliver. So I think it's two things, one of which is internal, the culture. The other bit is the source of funding and the expectations, and managing that and getting the two together, which again is another form of compromise. But I think, if you don't bring the two together, you run the risk of ending up with not the outcome you want.
Thank you, Rupert. That's a fascinating answer. And I didn't think I'd hear Sustainability Army being joined up in such a way. So yeah, fascinating. Interesting to note on that some of those companies you mentioned, they were founded by Quakers. So there is something perhaps to explore there separately about Quakers and their approach to doing business against the capital markets approach that you were describing, and perhaps being much more sustainably aligned, and always have been. So fascinating to explore that as well. I think maybe another episode. Who knows?
Another episode. I think we've used our time today. I do use that analogy about Quaker capitalism and do exactly the same phrase, which is basically look at these businesses. Someone would say they're not successful. Right. But they've taken a long-term approach, and they've thought about these things.
Correct. Yeah.
And therefore, actually, I think that is part of it. But you have to have permission to do so from your stakeholders and shareholders and other things. Yes. So it's not, there's not a magic wand.
No.
But I think there are some clearly trends and indicators that give you some indication that these things can be helpful in leadership and agility, which ultimately I guess is what this podcast is about.
Very good. Nicely done. Nicely summarized. So Quaker capitalism, that's what we're going to end on. I think that's a nice one for listeners to take away and explore. Before we say goodbye, Rupert, would you like to just tell listeners a bit more about, within a minute or so to go, how do they find out more about the Disruption House and get in touch with you if they're interested in developing sustainability more in their business?
Thanks, Ralph. So you can go to our website, which is www.thedisruptionhouse.com, which is all one word. Yep. Or you can look me up on LinkedIn. I'm Rupert Bull, and connect with me there, and or you can drop me an email at rupert.bull@thedisruptionhouse.com. And I think, be obviously delighted to help anybody think these things through. And obviously the one bit that's important is proportionality, right? So what you would seek to do as a very big business is different to what you might seek to do as an early stage business. But I think what we have seen, and we do continue to do, is that bigger businesses have more capability. So an expectation that if you're a bigger business, you use that capability well. And it's important to understand, that in the context of your industry sector and peers, because in some sectors, it's just much more critical for your stakeholders, internal and external, than others. But in any instance, it comes back to that, Quaker capitalism. I think there's good that can be done everywhere, and if we can collectively make everybody a bit better, then we make the whole world a lot better, which is beneficial because we all live on this planet.
Of course, that's it. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rupert. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us this week. It's been a pleasure hosting you all. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast player. And if you do like listening to Rupert, of course, get in touch and also leave us a review as well. It's always beneficial to our show. Thank you very much. And we'll see you soon in our next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.